Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into the chaotic, brutal, and honestly mind-boggling transformation of Russia. We're looking at a nation that went from a crumbling, centuries-old autocracy run by Tsars straight into the world's first communist state under Vladimir Lenin, and finally morphed into an absolute totalitarian regime controlled by Joseph Stalin. If you're studying this period, say for your junior cert history, getting a solid grip on this narrative is absolutely crucial. We're going to break down the key players, the massive policy shifts, and the devastating human cost step by step. So let's get into it.
We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed. That chilling warning from Joseph Stalin really sets the stakes for everything we're about to talk about today. He was looking at a Soviet Union that he believed was 50 to 100 years behind the West. For Stalin, rapid modernization wasn't just some nice economic goal, it was literally a matter of life and death for the state. But, as we're going to see, the price of that survival was ultimately paid by the Russian people themselves.
So here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the fall and Lenin's rise, then move into the power struggle, followed by forcing the modern age, and finally, we'll examine the machinery of terror.
Part 1. The Fall and Lenin's Rise.
Okay, let's rewind a bit to the collapse of Tsarist Russia. The immense pressures of World War I created the absolute perfect storm for a revolution, and the country just unraveled. In March 1917, food shortages and disastrous military defeats forced Tsar Nicholas II to step down. A provisional government stepped in to take over, but they made a huge, fatal mistake. They decided to stay in World War I, and the people, they absolutely hated that. This widespread anger opened the door right up for the November 1917 revolution, which plunged the country straight into a savage civil war between the communist Reds and the anti-communist Whites. Now, to win that war, the state imposed what was called War Communism. They basically seized factories and grain, which unfortunately caused a massive famine. Things got so bad that to save the economy from total collapse, they actually had to take a temporary step back toward capitalism in 1921 with something called the New Economic Policy, or NEP.
Through all of this chaos, one group managed to come out on top. It's really essential to understand exactly who the Bolsheviks were. They were a radical Marxist party led by a man named Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was incredibly sharp. He completely exploited the political vacuum left by the Provisional Government's mistakes. He organized armed forces known as the Red Guards and launched a swift, surprisingly bloodless coup to take over the Winter Palace.
Peace, land, and bread. That was Lenin's simple, unforgettable promise. And it was exactly what the exhausted, starving, and war-weary population desperately needed to hear. He won over the soldiers and the working class with just those 4 words. But you have to keep in mind, while Lenin was out there promising peace, he was simultaneously laying down some very dark authoritarian foundations behind the scenes. Things like creating a secret police force and banning rival political parties. And these were the exact tools that a certain bureaucrat would later pick up and use to devastating effect.
Part 2. The Power Struggle.
So when Lenin died in 1924, he left behind this massive power vacuum, which completely set the stage for a ruthless political thriller right at the top of the Communist Party. Now, on paper, Leon Trotsky was the absolute obvious successor. He was a flamboyant intellectual, a brilliant speaker, and the literal hero who organized the Red Army during the Civil War. His big idea was permanent revolution, the idea that they needed to spread communism all over the globe. But against him was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was this quiet, background administrator who was so wildly underestimated by his rivals that they actually nicknamed him Comrade Card Index. Stalin promoted a totally different idea called socialism in one country. He argued that the USSR needed to focus inward, making itself strong and safe first. And honestly, to a public that was just utterly exhausted by years of war, Stalin's plan sounded incredibly appealing.
But Stalin had one massive, looming problem. Right before he died, Lenin wrote a secret political will, which we now call Lenin's Testament, and in it, Lenin explicitly warned the party about Stalin. He literally wrote, "Stalin is too rude. I suggest that the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post." This document almost ruined Stalin. But his rivals, specifically guys like Kamenev and Zinoviev, disliked Trotsky so much that they made a fatal miscalculation. To protect their own interests, they agreed to keep Lenin's testament hidden. They genuinely thought Stalin was harmless and that they could easily control him.
Boy, could they not have been more wrong. You see, Stalin's boring-sounding job as general secretary secretly gave him the ultimate power: patronage. He controlled exactly who got promoted within the party, and he used that massive bureaucratic machine to execute a brilliant divide-and-conquer strategy. Step 1. He isolated Trotsky. He even went so far as to trick Trotsky into missing Lenin's funeral, which made Trotsky look incredibly disrespectful to the public. Step 2. Stalin allied with the right wing of the party to completely expel Trotsky and his left-wing supporters. And then, Step 3. In 1928, he abruptly turned on those very same right-wing allies, adopting radical economic policies to crush them too. By 1929, Trotsky was exiled, and Stalin was standing completely alone at the absolute top of the Soviet regime.
Part 3. Forcing the modern age.
Having totally eliminated his rivals, Stalin turned his absolute power toward radically transforming the Soviet economy. Remember his warning about being crushed if they didn't catch up to the West in 10 years? Well, this was his solution. He completely scrapped Lenin's semi-capitalist NEP and slammed down a strict command economy. Through a state agency called Gosplan, the government set incredibly demanding 5-year plans. These were laser-focused on heavy industry. We're talking coal, iron, and steel. Things like consumer goods, completely ignored. To hit these wild targets, the state commanded rapid industrial growth, building entire industrial megacities like Magnitogorsk right out of the dirt in the Ural Mountains. They pushed heavy propaganda to inspire the workers, hyping up heroes called Stakhanovites. They were named after a miner who supposedly mined an impossible 102 tons of coal in just one shift. But beneath all that glossy propaganda, the human cost was just horrific. The state relied heavily on disposable slave labor pulled from prison camps, where thousands of people literally died building these prestige projects.
Now, Stalin knew perfectly well that he couldn't build all these new cities or feed millions of new factory workers without having absolute control over the countryside. Enter collectivization. Stalin essentially declared war on traditional rural life. He forced peasants to surrender their private land, their animals, and their grain, merging everything into these massive, state-run farms called kolkhozy. As you might guess, the peasants absolutely hated this. They fought back by burning their own crops and slaughtering their livestock in protest. Stalin's retaliation was brutal. He targeted the relatively wealthier peasants, known as kulaks, and ordered their total liquidation as a class. Millions of them were executed or packed onto trains and deported to the frozen, unforgiving waste of Siberia.
The scale of control the state achieved was terrifying. By 1936, 90% of all Soviet farmland was collectivized. The state had complete, iron-fisted command over the food supply. But this massive upheaval triggered a catastrophic man-made famine. In Ukraine, this horrific tragedy is known as the Holodomor. An estimated 3.9 million people starved to death, largely because the state was seizing their grain at gunpoint just to export it and buy foreign factory machinery. It was an unfathomable human tragedy, deliberately used to fund Stalin's rapid industrialization.
Part 4. The Machinery of Terror.
By the mid-1930s, even with his total economic control, Stalin grew deeply, dangerously paranoid about hidden enemies and old rivals coming for him. In December 1934, a popular party leader named Sergei Kirov was assassinated, and Stalin used this murder as the absolute perfect excuse to launch a campaign of state-sponsored terror that we now call the Great Purges. He unleashed his secret police, the NKVD, to hunt down anyone, anywhere deemed an enemy of the state. Absolutely no one was safe. They targeted old Bolsheviks who had worked directly with Lenin, industrial managers who happened to miss their impossible production targets, intellectuals, and eventually just everyday, ordinary citizens. The NKVD operated on literal quotas. They used extreme physical and psychological torture to force completely innocent people into signing false confessions. The paranoia reached such irrational heights that Stalin actually turned on his own military. He executed 3 out of 5 marshals of his own Red Army, along with roughly half of the entire officer corps. He essentially decapitated his military leadership, which left the Soviet Union incredibly vulnerable right on the eve of World War II.
And for his highest-ranking victims, the very guys who helped found the 1917 revolution, Stalin staged these elaborate, highly theatrical show trials. Men like Kamenev and Zinoviev, the ones who had protected him years earlier, were broken by torture. They were then paraded in front of international journalists to confess to totally absurd crimes, like spying for Nazi Germany, before being dragged into the basement of the Lubyanka prison and shot. These show trials were a brilliant, sick psychological weapon. They provided Stalin with a convenient scapegoat for any economic failings in the country, and they sent a paralyzing, terrifying message to the general public. If the famous, untouchable founders of the revolution aren't safe, neither are you. Stalin maintained this absolute totalitarian grip by using two total extremes. On one hand, you had sheer physical terror. Anyone who wasn't executed was thrown into the Gulag. This was a brutal, sprawling network of forced labor camps out in Siberia where millions died from sheer exhaustion and freezing conditions. On the other hand, you had total mind control through a massive cult of personality. The state tightly controlled all media. History books were literally rewritten to airbrush Stalin's old rivals right out of existence. Instead, Stalin was worshipped daily in propaganda as the brilliant genius of humanity. It got to the point where young children were actively taught in school to love Stalin more than their own parents.
So what does this all mean? Look, Stalin undeniably transformed a backward peasant country into a massive industrial superpower in just over a decade, and historians generally agree that without this breakneck, ruthless industrialization, the Soviet Union simply wouldn't have had the military hardware needed to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. But the human cost of that progress was unparalleled. Millions starved to death in famines, millions were worked to death in the frozen gulags, and millions more were executed during the purges. When we study the rise of a superpower, how on earth do we weigh the survival of a state against the total destruction of its own people? Did the end justify those terrifying totalitarian means? It's a heavy question, but one you have to ask when looking at Stalin's Russia. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.